is, well, I got a minute, but we'll go ahead and get started. Time for us to begin week 7 of our Old Testament introduction. And I said last week we were going to try to get to Kings. I was mistaken about that. So we're going to try to get to Book of Samuel, but we'll see how that goes tonight. How many stories? We're in the Book of Judges. From your childhood, how many stories can you think of, Bible stories, from vacation Bible school or going to Bible school, can you think of in the Book of Judges? There are some that are just automatic that come to your mind. Samson and Delilah.
Oh, yeah.
Is one of the big ones. Little boys like to study about Samson because he's a big, strong guy. But you think about it, Delilah was amazed at Samson's strength, and she asked him, "Where does your strength come from?" He is the big Hercules Hulk-looking guy that we often have pictured in our storybooks. She wouldn't have asked that question. She would have said, "I can see where your strength comes from." He's probably some scrawny guy that, I can't believe you can put a gate on your shoulders like that. I can't believe you can kill 1,000 people with a jawbone like that. His physique did not agree with the strength that he had. So she asked him, "Where did you get your strength?" The pictures, I guess, are just sort of not according to the way we think. But if you think about how Samson must have been, it's probably, he wasn't that big Hercules-looking guy. Our children's books, children's curriculum in Bible school, they get a lot of stories from the Judges because, it's about heroes who win the day. And what little boy or little girl doesn't want to talk about heroes? Even your cartoons today, as weird as they sometimes are, you still have a hero who wins the day in most cases. In chapter 1, we read about the tribes of Judah and Simeon. They take up the cause of defeating the Canaanites in the land that Judah, the tribe of Judah, had been allotted. Judah asked Simeon if they would join up with them to do that, and Simeon did. And then later on, the agreement was Judah and Simeon would join up to go to Simeon's allotted territory and do the same thing. So Judges 1 tells us that they killed 10,000 men at Bezek, and when they caught Adoni-Bezek, which would have been king of Bezek, they cut off his thumbs and his big toes, which is the very thing that Adoni-Bezek had done to 70 kings, according to Mr. Bezek's own word. He had caught kings like he had been caught, and he cut off their thumbs and big toes, so that's what happened to him. I don't know about you, but as a little boy of 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, I think that'd be an interesting story to me about a guy getting his toes and thumbs cut off. Chapter 1, you read about Caleb. He's the guy we read about in the book of Numbers, one of the 2 tribes that are 2 spies that were faithful to God. And he said, told Joshua or Moses that I want that mountain that I went to spy it out. That's where I want to live when I get to Canaan. He had enough faith that he said, that's where I want to be. And so in chapter 1, we find that Caleb gets his mountain. He goes there and he drives out the sons of Anak, which would have been the giant. Chapter 1 also gives us the seed that explains really the whole problem of the book of Judges. And I wanted to take the time to read that. Let's look at Judges chapter 1, beginning in verse 21. It says, "But the children of Benjamin," we'll find Benjamin is a favorite subject of the author of the book of Judges, and there's a reason for that, I believe. But we'll get to that later. "But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem." Jerusalem actually belongs to Judah, but at first, I think Judah gave Benjamin Jerusalem, or Jebus as it was called at the time, Benjamin later lost Jerusalem to some enemies, and so Judah got it back. But at any rate, here in the beginning it says they did not drive out the Jebusites which inhabited Jerusalem, so the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. At this day, whoever is writing this Jerusalem has its name changed to Jerusalem. At that time, it was called Jebus, but at the time of writing, it's called Jerusalem. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel. The Lord was with them, so the house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly called Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy." So he showed them the entrance to the city and struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all of his family go, and the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which it is to this day. There's that phrase, "to this day" again. So we're looking at a historical event from a modern day, not our modern day, but the author's modern day perspective. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. You see an emphasis here? Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites dwell among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Ekah, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, or Helba, or Aphik, or Rehob. So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. See what the author is trying to tell us? He's living in the present, not our present, but his present. He's saying, I want you to look at what happened and why we're in the mess that we're in today. But they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. If you go on into chapter 2, it says, Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side. Their God shall be a snare to you. So it was when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of the Lord. The name of that place, Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. The rest of the chapter 2 sort of outlines the book, showing Israel's unfaithfulness. They did not drive out the people. They allowed the people to stay with them. God sending and afflicting enemy to them because they did not drive out the people and rather became like the people, worshiping their gods and so forth. And so God would send an afflicting enemy. Israel would then cry out. I don't know that the word repent is ever used in the book of Judges. Sometimes we would say that they repented and God forgave. I don't know that they repented. They cried out for help, just like they did in Egypt. They cried out initially for help. They didn't know the God to whom they were crying out, so it says they just cried out. Later on in Exodus, it says they cried out to God. But here again, they're crying out to God, and God would send a judge, what we call a judge, to save them from their self-inflicted misery. And that's really what the next section of the book is about, is the judges that God sent during the period of, or periods of rebellion, during the periods of being tormented, plundered by their enemies because of their rebellion, God would send a judge when they would cry out. And we're going to look, we're not going to spend a lot of time in talking about these judges. They're easy to read in the text before you, so we're not going to spend a lot of time doing that. But sometimes we get the impression in reading it like a narrative that, well, there was Othniel, then there was Shamgar, then there was Deborah, then there was Gideon, and it's a chronological event that God would send one after the other. Probably that's not how it was. God was raising up judges in different parts of the land. The land was divided out to the different tribes. This tribe was having trouble with the Midianites. This tribe was having trouble with the Amalekites. So God would raise up a judge over here, and God would raise up a judge over here. Maybe there's two judges living at the same time. Because if not, we have a time problem of about 400 years. If we had all the time that's given to us in the book of Judges, it takes up about 400 years, and we don't have 400 years to give them in the light of history. It's probably a lot less than that to give you a complete, because it's not chronological, it's really hard to say just how long the period of the judges was. But I don't think it was 400 years, which that's what it would be if you added up all the years that we are given. So the first one we have is Othniel. He is actually Caleb's nephew, and he came up against a guy by the name of Cushan Rishathaim. Big old long name for a guy. It's probably a title to the king of Mesopotamia, like Pharaoh's a title to the king. It wasn't his name. Cushan Rishathaim was king of Mesopotamia, and he plundered Israel for 8 years. Othniel was raised up to defeat Cushan Rishathaim, and according to the text, they had a period of rest there for 40 years because of Othniel. And then you come to the left-handed judge. He's called left-handed judge because he was left-handed, and it figures into the story. His name was Ehud. He came up against Moab, Eglon, who was king of Moab. And the Bible says, Eglon was a terribly fat man, a very, very obese man. And Ehud came to him and I guess had lunch with him. And he says, I have a secret to tell you, a secret from God. And he asked, it's only for your ears. So he asked his guards to leave, give us a few minutes alone. And so Ehud took out his dagger with his left hand as he came up to whisper into the guy's ear, and he stabbed him. And the Bible's pretty, again, one of these children's stories that you don't tell the children. He stabbed him, and the fat was so much that the knife took in Ehud's hand. And then it says all the dirt fell out. And then Ehud left, and he told the guards, he says, your boss is gone to the restroom, give him a few minutes. And that's pretty much the end of the story. There's some more to it, but because of Moab, Israel suffered 18 years under them, but Ehud came and was a savior to them, and the text says they had 80 years of rest. Then we're introduced to Shamgar. He killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad. That's about all that we know about Shamgar. What do you know about Deborah? We talk a lot about Deborah. She was a prophetess, and she was the judge. She was judging Israel at that time, and she had the commander of her army was by the name of Barak. I believe it's Barak, yeah. And that story is found in Judges chapter 4. Judges chapter 5 is really a song of Deborah and Barak. But Barak was afraid to go to war without Deborah. And so Deborah said, well, if that's the way you want it, that's the way it'll be. But it'll be that your name won't go down in history as the victor in this battle. It will be given to a woman, which would have been a disgrace to a guy who was a standing general, that a woman would take the credit for the battle. And if you know how it turned out, there you'll find that Sisera was the opposing enemy. Jabin was the king of Canaan, and Sisera was his captain. And after a long battle, it looked like things weren't going to go well, so Sisera took off, and he ended up in the tent of a woman by the name of Jael. And you remember what happened to him?
She put a tent peg through his.
Something entered into his head that had never been there before. That's right. She put a tent peg, and she gave him some warm milk or warm something, I think, put him to sleep, and she nailed him to the floor. And such a thing had never entered into his head, one guy said. I thought that was pretty funny. Then you come to Gideon. Gideon takes up a little more time or a little more text than do the others thus far. He was in conflict with the Midianites and the Amalekites. The text says Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. What would happen is the Israelites would grow their crops, and the Midianites would come in at harvest time and take them. And so the Israelites didn't have anything. They were hungry because the Midianites would come in and take their food. And when they found when the angel came to Gideon and says, God's calling you, Gideon, do you remember where Gideon was? He was in a wine press hiding. And I think it's funny, interesting, that the angel came to him and calls him Gideon, you mighty man of valor, because he's there hiding in that wine press or oil press, which really, I think that's a bit of sarcasm. You're not a mighty man of valor. You're a guy hiding in a wine press. But God chooses you to be the deliverer. And Gideon himself says, how can you choose me? I'm not a mighty man of valor. I'm not a wealthy man. I'm the least in my father's family. How can you pick me? And Gideon was sufficiently humble, maybe even, you might say, a scaredy cat, a wimp. And God says, you know what? You're the guy I want, because if you win, then everybody will know that it wasn't you who done it. It was me who done it. In Judges chapter 6, verse 20, it says, the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and offer them or lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. That is, Gideon did so. And the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock. I used to think that it was one of those occasions where lightning struck it and consumed it, like it happened in the book of Leviticus. That's not what happened here. It says fire rose up out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that this was an angel of the Lord. So Gideon says, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord God said, peace be with you, do not fear, and you shall not die. Later on in the same chapter, Gideon says, well, God, I need a sign from you to prove that you will do as you say. Now he's just seen an angel, and he's just seen a rock, fire come out of a rock and consume the sacrifice that he had laid upon the rock there. And he says, now I need a sign. I wonder what God's thinking. I just gave you a sign. He did give him a sign anyway. There was, he put a fleece out on the ground, and during the nighttime, the fleece was dry, but the ground around it was was wet. And Gideon says, well, okay, that was a nice trick. Let's do it the other way. Let's make the fleece wet and the ground dry. And I may have got those transversed, but it happens over 2 different nights. And God did it to give him the sign, the conviction that he needed to be the man that God wanted him to be. And then there was the choosing of Gideon's army. He started out with 32,000 men. God said it's too much. You need to get rid of some folks. And so Gideon says, everybody who's afraid, go home. 20,000 men went home. he's left with 10,000 to go fight the Amalekites and the Midianites. And it says about the Amalekites and the Midianites, all the people of the east, Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as the sea by the seashore in a multitude. So there's thousands and thousands of the enemy army out there. Gideon starts out with 32,000. God said it's too much. He's got 10,000 left, and then he takes them to the water, and he says, get you a drink of water, and God says, the ones that get on their knees and lap like a dog, you keep those. The ones who drink otherwise, you let them go home. 300 men lap like a dog. So it's 300 against all the people of the east who were in the valley as numerous as locusts. So that's a pretty significant thing. And as you read the story, you'll find how they were able to conquer them that in one evening, as a matter of fact, they were able to conquer them. 7 years he judged them. Then they had 40 years of peace. As soon as Gideon was dead, the Bible says the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. So they have a short memory. They had peace for 40 years because of the 7 years that Gideon was with them, but then, or they judged them, but as soon as Gideon was dead, they go right back. Anyway, you find Gideon's story in chapter 6 through 8, and then in Judges chapter 8, you find the story of Abimelech, which is Gideon's son. Interesting story that goes back and forth there, actually. Tola is the next judge. We find him in chapter 10. He judged for 23 years. That's all we know about him. Jair, he judged for 22 years in Judges chapter 10. So all we know about him is he had 30 sons that rode 30 donkeys, and they had 30 towns. After Jair, there was an interlude. I want to take the time to look at that in Judges chapter 10, verse 6 beginning. It says, then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, served the Baals, the Ashtaroths, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the people of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines, into the hands of the people of Ammon. From that year, they harassed and oppressed the children of Israel for 18 years, all the children of Israel who were on the other side of Jordan, the land of the Amorites, in Gilead. Moreover, the people of Ammon crossed over the Jordan to fight against Judah, also against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was severely distressed. And then the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you, because we have both forsaken our God and served theirs, the Baals. So the Lord said to the children of Israel, did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and from the people of Ammon and from the Philistines? Also the Sidonians, the Amalekites, the Moabites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I delivered you from their hand? Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Go and cry out to their gods, which you have chosen. Let them deliver you from your time of distress. And the children of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do to us whatever seems best to you. Only deliver us this day, we pray. So they put away their foreign gods from among them and served the Lord, and his soul could no longer endure the misery of Israel. So God is a compassionate God. He's angry, and he wants them to be punished. He wants them to, through the punishment that he has given them, for them to turn, and they don't seem to be willing to do that. But when they cry out to them, he can't bear the cry, it seems, and so he sends a judge. Then you have Jephthah. What do you know about Jephthah? Remember anything about him from your Bible studies? He's the guy that made a vow that the next thing that comes through my gate, which he thought would be a lamb or a goat or a donkey or whatever, the next thing, he's doing it in thanksgiving to God, the next thing that comes through my gate, I will sacrifice to God. And the next thing that came through the gate was his daughter. And some people say he made a human sacrifice of her according to his vow. Some people say no, because God's not going to accept a human sacrifice. And Jephthah seems to be a person who is accepted as a good man. So probably he made a sacrifice of her being a perpetual virgin, from what we can read in the text. That's how I get it anyway.
Didn't she ask to go away for like 3
She went
months?
away, and they bemoaned her virginity. Now, I think basically what it is, Jephthah had no heritage any further because of the vow that he made. He made a rash vow, and he wanted to keep the vow, and maybe he did keep the vow by human sacrifice. I don't see that as something that would have been acceptable to God. But at any rate, he did in some way fulfill the vow, and it cost him. And a vow should cost you. If you make a vow, you should pay the vow. And I think he did in some way pay that vow. Next, we find Ibzan. And again, I'm not going into all these stories that we can find in these Judges. A lot of them are very interesting, but you can read them in the text. They're not deep-secreted or hard to understand. You can get them for yourself. That's what I hope you'll do. But Ibzan of Bethlehem in Judges chapter 12, verse 9, it says he had 30 sons, gave away 30 daughters in marriage, and brought in 30 daughters from elsewhere for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years. That's all we know about him. Elon judged Israel for 10 years. Abdon, he had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode 70 donkeys. He judged Israel 8 years. I wonder why the writer of Judges saw it important to put that information in there, that the 70 sons or 40 sons, 30 grandsons, 70 donkeys, and the same thing about Ibzan and a couple others. He named their son, not named, but counted their sons and their daughters and in-laws and all that. Just curious to me why that's there. I'm sure the Jews had a reason for it. It may have been just interesting reading that he wanted them to have. I don't know. Samson is the next judge. He judged Israel 40 years under the Philistine oppression, or actually there were 40 years of Philistine oppression, and Samson judged Israel for 20 years. And he was pretty vicious against them. I guess you know the story of Samson, or at least are familiar with it. He was born to Manoah and his wife in their older years, and he was born under a vow, the Nazarite vow. The mother had promised that if you'll give me a son, I'll make him a Nazarite. And so she did. And he was not to cut his hair. A razor was not to touch his head. He couldn't take of the fruit of the vine. He couldn't touch a dead body. Those were some of the stipulations of the Nazarite vow. And Samson, as he got older, he sort of just didn't care about the vow. He's not supposed to touch a dead body, but he regularly went and got honey out of a dead lion's carcass. And he used that as a riddle later on in his conflict with the Philistines. He lived among the Philistines a lot. He went through, I think, several women, was pretty much the party guy. Forget what happened to his first wife, but anyway, I do know what happened to her. That's the one who the riddle was about, and when he told the riddle, she gave the secret away to the Philistines, and she ended up getting married to the best man. And Samson set the Philistines' fields on fire by catching foxes, tying their tails together, and setting them on fire and going throughout the crops. But anyway, he ends up hooking up with Delilah, a Philistine prostitute, and things got worse for Samson. He lost his sight, but then in the end, he brought down the temple of Dagon and killed more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. Samson's a kind of a hard one to figure in a lot of ways. How is he judging Israel? How is he able to be a judge of Israel in the sense of what we think of as a judge, meting out people's problems and things of that nature, when he was such a wild card himself? But God used his strength, or gave him strength and used that strength to end the oppression of the Philistines. Whether Samson gave any good advice to anybody or counsel to anybody, I don't know, but he did end the oppression of the Philistines with the strength that God gave him. But he also ended his life because of the way he used that strength. Again, the book of Judges. It's a great storybook for little boys, maybe little girls, I don't know, because it has so many choices for heroes. And that's what the judges were. They were, you could say, local heroes. The word judges in the Hebrew can also be translated as saviors. And that's what they were. They were saving the people from their enemies. They came and rescued, you might say, the damsel in distress. And the damsel in this case were the various tribes and peoples of and the cities of Israel. But Israel was no innocent damsel, as the storyline goes. She was a vixen who played the harlot and got caught with her trousers down several times. And so she had to be rescued from the way that she had made herself. It wasn't so much what the enemies did to her, it's what she did to herself, and that resulted in what the enemies did. But when you leave these stories in their context, they're not children's stories. In fact, some of them are quite horrible. Horror stories that you could scare your kids to death if you told them all the story. You know, we edit them for our kids so we can let them see the hero, but there are some stories here that you can't edit because they're so horrible. And the author of Judges is trying to help us see just how bad things, the further you go into the story, the more horrible, or the further you go into the book, the more horrible the stories become. And it's like the book of Numbers. You know, we talked about when we talk about the book of Numbers that the last half of the book of Numbers didn't have to be written. If they had done what they were supposed to do at the beginning of Numbers, they would be in the land of Canaan in 11 days, but they didn't, and so it took them 40 years. Well, the book of Judges is like it. It didn't have to be written. These horrible stories that are taking place here didn't have to take place. All they had to do is obey God. Just, you know, I'll bless you. You be with me. You stay with me. You be faithful, and I'll bless you. You'll take over this land, and it'll be yours. You'll glow like a diamond throughout the whole Mediterranean area. And we'll talk about some of the more horrible stories in just a moment. The books of Joshua, or Judges, and Ruth, Joshua too for that matter, but mostly Judges and Ruth, they are about the same period of time. You could say, well, actually the text does say, that Ruth, the events of the book of Ruth took place during the time of the book of Judges. So it's synonymous, or not synonymous, but history, two different stories of history from the same time. And the books truly belong together chronologically, and it may be, some have suggested that they were written by the same author and actually were considered one book at one time. I don't know that I can prove that. They were considered one book. The Hebrews did not. They put them in two different sections, actually. They were separated. We have them together, and I think they do belong together. But Ruth is like a bit of sunshine that shines out of the foreboding, gloomy, dark pit of the time of Judges. When my third grandchild was born, she was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was a dark, stormy night. And in fact, my wife and the other grandparents had gone out to do something, and I stayed there with the baby and my daughter. And there was a tornado warning, and so they had us all come into the middle of the hospital and get away from the windows and stuff like that. So I got to hold the brand new baby that nobody was supposed to hold. until later, but I counted that as a blessing. But at any rate, the next day I had to get back to Atlanta. The storms were still in the area, but looking at the news, I thought, well, it looks like this storm is passing through and this storm's coming, and I can get out during that break. So that's what I did. I tried to get out during that break. I misread the weather forecast, apparently, because there was no break. It was the worst weather I had ever driven in all of my life. And I was white knuckled from Memphis all the way to, all the way to Atlanta. You might recall the day of that storm. It was the storm or the storms that destroyed Tuscaloosa.
Oh, yeah.
And there were, when I got home and looked at the weather and what it was, where I had been, I think I wrote down, 21 different tornadoes in the area where I was about the same time I was there. And when I looked up in the sky as I was driving, I felt like they were there, and I was fortunate enough to miss them by minutes before or after it, but I was scared to death that whole day. But when I came to Atlanta, or as I was approaching Atlanta, the sky was clearing, or at least the storms hadn't come, and I broke out of the storms and I could see a clear sky, and it just made me feel like a ton of weight had been lifted off of me. I came from that gloomy pit into a sunny sky. Well, I think when I go from Judges to Ruth, that's how I feel. I go from a gloomy pit of horror to, I think you mentioned Ruth last week as being a stellar character, a great woman, and truly she was that. The Bible, and this is one of the things I want us to get from this series of studies, it's a unique book as far as the way it is written and the purpose it's written. Unlike a lot of other sacred books like the Quran and books by Confucius or things of that nature, there's a lot of history in the Bible, not just for the sake of recording history, but the history has a purpose. It's not a book of religious rules about how you can go to heaven and win 1,000 virgins. It's a history, but it's not an ordinary history. It's a history with you might say, a purpose, or with a moral. It's not a tale that has a moral, like Aesop's Fables is a tale that has a moral at the end. This is true history, but it's history written by God, and it does have a moral. I have in my library at home, and it mostly collects dust, an 11-volume set of the history, or it's called The Story of Civilization by Will Durant. Each of those books is about that thick, and there's 11 of them. And it takes you from way back when till, well, not to modern times, but pretty much modern times. And if you ever want to take a nap in the middle of the day, grab one of those books and you'll be out in 10 minutes. I mean, it's just dry, boring, horrible to read material. When you open the Bible, you'll find sections that are a little more, you might say, dry than others. The book of Leviticus is hard. If you don't understand why Leviticus is written, and you don't go to Leviticus for the purpose of understanding why it was written, you're not going to get a lot out of Leviticus. In fact, you won't read it. You'll come to it after you get done with Exodus, and you'll say, that's not fun. And you go to Numbers, and you'll read a while, and then Numbers becomes not fun. But then you get back into Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. Oh, we got more stories. No, we like narratives. We like stories, and it's like that. And there are some portions of the Bible that are a little more hard to deal with because we don't necessarily understand the purpose. But when you understand their purpose and see how they fit in the whole story, your interest becomes piqued, and you'll go back to Leviticus and say, I want to know about that. And it's really helpful when you get to that point in your studies. The difference between Will Durant and his Story of Civilization and God's story is Mr. Durant simply recorded what nations and peoples have done or experienced throughout time. The Bible is the record of, it's God's record of what God has done, and how in doing that he used men and women and nations and those who are his friends and those who are his enemies. He used these people of antiquity to accomplish his purpose. He could have come down and just done it, but he didn't do it that way. He used men, the decisions that men make. He didn't force them to make decisions or compel them. He didn't drive them and say, you're going to do this. But he used the decisions of both his friends and his enemies to accomplish his will, and the Bible is the record of that happening. Some people view history as a series of cycles where things tend to go in full circle. What we're living today, people have, in 400 years ago, they were doing the same thing, only with less technology. And we just can continue to make the same mistakes and continue to follow the same cycles. There's little actual forward progression in history from their perspective. It's just aimless, futile activity. And when you write down history, you're just writing down the same things every 200 or 300 years. When you can change the names, change the characters, and it's just the same thing happening again. Like Rome, back in about 2,000 years ago, how it came to be, how it fell away. The same thing happened to Babylon before them. The same thing happened to Persia after Babylon. The same thing happened to Greece. And you make the modern day application, the same thing is happening to America. And there is a sense where you can see those cycles taking place in history, but some people's perspective is that it's just all futile. There's no point. It's not going anywhere. We're just making the same mistakes. We're going through the same cycles over and over again. And that's just how they see history, that nothing is progressing. The technology progresses, but it still doesn't help us. They say that you go back 5,000 years ago, what do you see people doing? Well, they're scratching out a living. They're trying to come out on top. They're trying to see who can get the most power, the most glory, and the most riches. Well, what are we doing today? Same thing. It's nothing has changed.
Kind of good reason for the writing of Ecclesiastes.
That is a point to the book of Ecclesiastes. And they say that in any age, it's always the same. You got the poor, you got the disenfranchised, you got the people who are being trodden upon, you got the people who are trotting upon them. You have the perverted, you have the thieves, the murderers, you have honest people and kind people. All of these are, from time to time, there may be more of one than the other, but it all sort of evens out. 5,000 years ago, someone was selling the best spear on the market, the best bow and arrow on the market. And today we're selling the best missile, the best bomb. Nothing's changed. We just can be more efficient and more effective in our destruction, but nothing's really changed. We're still doing the same. Technology hasn't helped us. It's just, or hasn't changed us. It's only made us more proficient. Well, that's one way of viewing history. But there's another view, and I want us to see this in the Bible, that what we have recorded here is a true history. It's not recording world history in the sense that he's not telling us what's happening to all the other places in the world. We're focused in on one particular area or one particular group because this is where God's emphasis is in trying to bring about his purpose. One sees here that there is a sense of purpose in all that is being recorded. And he's not making up stuff. What is being recorded is actually happening, and he's showing us that God is, I'm in control of this. I'm involved in this. Now, he's not involved to the degree that he's causing people to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do, but he takes the things that they would ordinarily do, and then he uses that to accomplish his purpose, whether it be good or evil. God can use the evil decisions that people make, like Pharaoh, and still accomplish his purpose. So the Bible history is written in that vein. In the normal recorded history, God or gods are a figure of superstitious people, and maybe even depending upon the historian, a participant in the events. But the reader of the Bible needs to understand this is not a book written by men. This is God's book about God's story. It's God's record of what I've been doing, not me, but what God has been doing from the beginning. And it's not taking snapshots of history and saying this happened on this day. That's what Will Durant does. This happened on this day, and then the next thing happened on the next day. He's just giving us a world history. There's no point to it other than just to tell you what happened on that day in history, and then they move on to the next scene. Well, God doesn't do it that way. He has a purpose. He does move from scene to scene, but he's showing us a chain of events that in which he was involved. He's involved in lots of other chains of events that aren't even recorded, but the chain of events that he's recording here is helping us to understand, helping us to see I'm in control, and I'm bringing something to pass. This is all leading to a climax, you might say. It's leading to something that I'm bringing to pass. I've got something that I'm intending to do. Paul talks about it in the New Testament about the mystery of God, the mystery of the ages, and how that mystery is revealed in the church or by the church. We are the revelation of what God was doing from Genesis chapter 1 all the way up through the cross and then some. We are that fulfilled mystery, or the revelation of what God was doing during that time. But in that time, before he revealed his mystery in the New Testament, in that time he was revealing what he was doing to bring that mystery to pass. God has a purpose. He's in control. He has been, is bringing, and will bring all things to the end that he intends. It's his story, and we need to see that. And when we come to a book like Judges, as ugly as it is, as horrible as it is, God's working in this, not just in the sense of bringing enemies against rebellious Israel. He's working in this to accomplish his desire, his end results. Some of the book of Judges has something to do with us today. It's not just telling what happened to them back then. It still has, he does do that, but it also has involvement or impact upon us today. And he doesn't, want to emphasize that, I guess. He doesn't come into our affairs, using the words of Paul. He doesn't come into men's affairs and force them to do things, force them to make decisions that they would not have make, or do things that they would not have done. But he takes the decisions that they make, the things that they do, and he uses those things, good or evil.
The negative results that will occur if we don't obey.
That's right. And he will take that disobedience, whether it be of a Jew or a King Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar. He will take whatever it is that they do. When we get to the story of the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is complaining to God. He's a prophet. He says, your people are just ridiculous. They're so bad. Why do you let them do this? And he says, have a seat, Habakkuk, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. And he says, I'm going to bring Babylon, a pagan nation from the north, and I'm going to I'm paraphrasing, of course, I'm just going to eat up the Israelites. And Habakkuk said, no, you can't do that. How can you use a pagan nation? You're first complaining to God because he's doing nothing. Then God says, I'll do something. I'll use this pagan nation to accomplish. No, you can't do that. And that's when Habakkuk finally came to grips with, he's dealing with God, and God knows what he's doing. He says, the Lord's in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. In other words, he's telling himself, Habakkuk, sit down and shut up and let God do what he's going to do. But anyway, in a way that only God can, he uses decisions of men that they make, be they good decisions or evil decisions, to continue his push toward the end that he is aiming at, part of which is fulfilled in the church, but then he's still working, even in the last 2,000 years, toward a continued or future end of Christ coming again and taking us back to heaven. So God's not quit working just because Revelation has stopped. doesn't mean that God's no longer involved in the affairs of men. But you take take Abraham, for example. Before Abraham, there was no Jewish nation. He is the first, you could call him a Jew. It's an argument that Paul makes in the book of Romans. But anyway, he takes Abraham and he says, follow me and I will, and he makes promises. He says in Genesis chapter 12, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There's what God's looking for. All the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's what God wants. That's the purpose that he's aiming at. Abraham can't see that in Abraham's time, but the book of Hebrews tells us that they were searching for a city whose builder and founder was God. They didn't see what you and I can see, but God made promises to him that if you will follow me, this is where we're going. This is where it's going to lead. And there were physical blessings there as well as spiritual blessings. But what if, when God showed up in Ur of the Chaldees and says, follow me, and I will make you a great nation and so forth, Abraham says, no, I'm good where I am. He was in Ur of the Chaldees. It was a metropolitan area, and Abraham probably had it pretty nice where he was. And God's saying, leave that and become a vagabond. Leave that and become a nomad. Live in a tent for the rest of your life. And Abraham could have said, no, I'm not going to do that. What would God have done? Well, he would have used that decision in some way, and it would be speculation to say what it was because it didn't happen that way, but somehow, some way, God would have either chosen someone else or did something different to it. He's going to bring about his purpose. The story of Abraham would not have been there. There would have been a different story with different characters. But Abraham, it wasn't because Abram was special and that he was the only person in the world. It's just that God had to choose someone, and he chose Abram. And I guess God, knowing the future, knew that Abram would not, or that would go with him and follow him. But he used Abraham's decision. But if Abraham had made a different decision, he would have used that as well and continued to make his go toward his purpose. And again, that purpose was the blessing that all men can have through Jesus Christ, who is the descendant, the seed of Abraham. But all the history of the Old Testament was leading to that point, to Jesus, the Son of God, coming into the world and bringing into fulfillment God's promises and what God had foreordained before the beginning of the world. And I think God is still using lives and still using your decisions and mine to lead us to that point at the end of time, whenever God decides that is, a point wherein he will destroy all the chaos that we talked about in the book of Genesis, and all those who will be saved or are saved will be saved. Those who put their faith in God will be saved. You might remember in that thought that there in the book of Exodus, God was angry at Israel. He told Moses, I'm just done with them. I'm going to destroy them and make from you, Moses, another people. And he could have done that right there. But he didn't. Moses interceded, prayed to God and interceded on behalf of the people, and God changed his mind. But the point is, God was going to bring Christ into the world, and there's no power in heaven or earth that could have kept God from doing that. Even Israel's rebellion, as much as they rebelled, could not keep God from accomplishing his purpose. The book of Judges, going back to that, in the book of Ruth, like the rest of the Bible, they fit into that divine history. God recording what he's doing among humans to bring about the purpose, the end that he wants to accomplish, which is the salvation of souls. And give an opportunity for all men to come to repentance. Judges and Ruth fit into that somehow. As ugly as the book of Judges is, it fits into that story, and it presents a history of the people of God from the seed of Abraham who lived without knowledge of God. They had to put themselves in a position where they no longer knew God, just like the people in Exodus. They were children of Abraham, but they got to a point that they were so far away from God and so involved in the world of Egypt that they had forgotten who their God was. And so in the book of Exodus, God had to remind them of Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4 through 50. This is who I am. I'm the God you forgot, and the God of your fathers. Well, we're sort of doing that, coming into that same situation again. There's no new book of Genesis being written, but we're in a place where the seed of Abraham have disobeyed God and have really forgotten who he is. We're going to stop right there and come back because I want to read a text in the book of Deuteronomy. It'll take us a minute to do that. So I'll take a break right there, and I'll come back and look at how the people are in the book of Judges, how the people got to where they are in the book of Judges. Hello, Vincent.
Hello, Mike.
Uh-oh, I don't have your own.
Did you lose him?
Well, there you are.
All right.
Now I can hear you. I hope you didn't ask me questions earlier because I didn't have your volume on. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I didn't ask any questions. I had got out from work, so I turned you on.
Okay. I forgot to send you that treaty information that you asked for, but I'll get that done this week.
Okay. Thank you.
We're going to take a break for a couple minutes here. I'll just leave.
All right.
I'm going to pause the recording. I think that leaves you guys there, but I'm just going to pause the recording so as not to waste time on it.
Okay.
If I can find it, how to do that. Pause recording. We're back on. All right, to help us understand a little bit about why where we are in the book of Judges, why the people are like they are in this story. We have a period of a section of people under the leadership of Joshua, and then the section of people, or the age of people, era of people, I guess, in the book of Judges, and they seem to be night and day difference. And in Joshua, they were obedient to God. In Judges, they don't even hardly know who he is. So I want to take you back to get a little background for that. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I think as good as the people of Joshua were, or Joshua's day, they made a horrible, horrible mistake. And I think that mistake is outlined here in Joshua chapter 6 before they made it. It's Joshua chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 6. When we studied that a couple of weeks ago, we noted that the Hebrews called this the Shema. Not that that's important, it is to them. But listen to what it says. Again, it's a long reading, so bear with me. Now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God commanded to teach you. This is Moses speaking to the children of Israel. These are the children of Israel who came in under Joshua. These are not the ones who left Egypt. These are those people's children. The ones who left Egypt are dead in the wilderness. were about to cross over the Jordan River, and God has given them Moses has given them the law the second time. So here is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments which I command you and your son and your grandson all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, that is, that your way may prosper, that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. So you do this, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Just do what I say here. What did I say? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. And these are the words which I command you today. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk with them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a large and beautiful cities you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. When you have eaten and are full, then beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. How do you not forget? You tell your children when you walk by the way, when you rise up, when you lay down, you keep telling them those stories. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and you shall take oaths in his name. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people who are around you. For the Lord your God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord your God be aroused against you, and you destroy and destroy you from the face of the earth. You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, his testimonies, his statutes, which he has commanded you, and you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with you, and that you may go in and possess the good land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to cast out your enemies before you, as the Lord has spoken. And when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, and great and severe, against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all of his household. Then he brought us out from there, and that he might bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. Then it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all these commandments before the Lord our God has commanded us. So they came in under Joshua, having just heard this read to them. They came in under Joshua, and they were gangbusters. They were going by the power of God into this city, into that city, and destroying and capturing and taking all the blessings that God had promised them. And while they were doing it, they should have been what? Teaching their kids. The ordinances, the things that they had just heard here, they needed to continue to repeat those to the kids, so that those kids would tell it to their kids, and those kids would tell it to their kids. Well, one generation difference is what we have between Joshua and Judges. I don't know if there's any children or grandchildren in the mix there. I think you have the people under Joshua, they had kids, and you had the people under Judges. That's who we're talking about, them and their children and grandchildren. And they are like they are in Judges because they're good parents who were faithfully following God and Joshua in the book of Joshua. except that they didn't teach their kids. Now, how applicable is that to the church today?
Parents today do not parent.
We have to teach our kids. Our kids cannot know God unless we help them understand. We tell them the testimonies and commandments. I'm not here to preach a sermon, but that's a sermon that needs to be preached. We need to teach our kids. I think I told you once before that the guy I was reading after said that God has no grandchildren. Each generation has to come to know him, and you can't come in under your parents' faith. But your parents still have the responsibility to show you the testimony, show you the markers that prove to you or show you that there is a God and he cares and he wants to be involved in your life. I don't think these parents were evil, nor do I think parents in the church today who have failed to teach their kids. The parents grew up in the church and they know and they understand and they believe and they love God, and I don't doubt that none whatsoever. But when they don't teach the kids, you're destroying the future of the church as well as destroying the future of that child. We have to teach our kids. I don't think that parents, unless they just choose not to teach the kids, and I think in most cases it's an oversight, terrible oversight, but that's what it is. We get so caught up in making a life for ourselves. I mean, these guys, they were coming out of the wilderness and getting into new homes that they didn't build, drinking out of wells they didn't drink, and eating fruit that they didn't plant. And it was, wow, this is wonderful. And they were just absorbing this new life, but they forgot to thank God. They forgot to show the children that, we got this from the hand of God. And I want you to know who this God is, and then teach them his commandments. And they didn't do it. It wasn't an act of rebellion on their part. It was just terribly, terribly, terribly unfortunate oversight. And as a result, their children, their lives became horrid. And they entered into a deadly cycle. Look in Judges chapter 2. Beginning in verse 10, it says, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, that is, the generation of Joshua, the generation of the people that came in under Joshua. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them. This is the next generation. These aren't grandchildren. Or maybe it could be grandchildren, because it says when they had been gathered to their fathers. So it could be that it's not the immediate generation afterwards, but it's pretty close. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them, which did not know the Lord, did not know the work which he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel, did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served Baals. Why? Because their parents, or grandparents, if that's what it was, did not teach them what God said in Deuteronomy chapter 6 they should teach them. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed after the gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baals and Ashtaroths, and the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. So God was punishing them. He wasn't kicking them out. He wasn't going to destroy them, but he wanted them to get the point. You need me. You need to understand who I am. I'm working with you through this, but if you turn away from me, you have nothing. And you only have those people to whom you turn and their gods. And this cycle really never ended for Israel. Judges is a picture of what happens in a short period of time, probably 100 or so years of the time of Judges, but it's also a picture, prophetically, I think you could say, of what happened to Israel for the next 1,000 years until Christ came. And this is the picture. They kept making the same mistakes over and over again, not telling their children, not teaching their children, and it just caused a cycle, a horrid and deadly cycle for the Jews and for their kids throughout the centuries. When people don't know God, they get up out of bed, they go to work, they come home, they watch television, they go to bed, they get up out of bed, they go to work, they come home, they watch television, they go to bed, they get up, the cycle just goes on and on. There's nothing, their life is futile and endless. They may end the process of going to work and making money and buy stuff, and so they can spend stuff or have stuff, but that stuff leads to futility because they don't know God. Nothing good comes from it. Oh, happiness and fun times at the beach and whatever, all that comes from it. And I'm not saying that God's opposed to that, but what I'm saying is that if we don't know God, then we're not going to know his purpose or be accomplishing his purpose, and our life becomes just a futile nothing. When we come to the end, we have nothing, including God. Well, that's what the book of Judges is about. It's about how dark and evil that cycle can become when the knowledge of God is left out. The book of Ruth, on the other hand, as we mentioned already, is more in keeping with the way God intends his people to proceed through life. And it's not a perfect book. The characters in the book of Ruth aren't perfect people. We'll find mistakes there too, mistakes that they have made. But we overall, the book of Ruth is about how God intends his people to proceed through life. And it's really through the perspective of a pagan woman who saw something among the Jews and says, I want that. There was something there that she saw. There were probably some things that she could see that says, well, they're just like us. But she saw something among the Jews that she knew. Maybe it was Naomi. But she saw something there that says, I want to be a part of that. I want to know that God. I want that God to be my God. Anyway, it's a wonderful story in the book of Ruth, and we'll get to that in a minute. But we need to see that there is purpose and meaning in life, and it's a movement towards a goal. And we can see that in Ruth, where we really can't see it in Judges, because Judges is, well, it's about judgment. God bringing judgment. It is about him raising up judges, but it's also about him bringing judgment upon the people.
There's some compassion among people shown in Ruth.
There is. There's some compassion. There's a lot of interesting things in the book of Ruth, and we won't have time to delve into all of it, but I do want to see some of the things that are enlightening there in just a moment. If you think about the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, I suppose we could sum them up like this. Joshua led the people of Israel into Canaan. They followed God. When Joshua died, there was no national leader appointed. There was reasons for that. But the tribes were all divided out, and they were to be led by the elders and the leaders of their particular tribes or families. And those elders and leaders weren't doing what God said in Deuteronomy chapter 6. They weren't teaching the kids about what God had done. And so we have this dark consequence that the book of Judges is about. That whatever the reason was, they didn't teach those children, and God was left out, and it left the people severely weakened. So they entered into this cycle that we see of apostasy and idolatry and adultery, as it's described in the book of Judges. Then the book of Ruth shows that God had not forgotten them. As horrible as that was in Judges, God had not forgotten them. and was still working in the affairs of men and the decisions of men. He was preparing them for a king. Not necessarily King Saul, but not to exclude King Saul. He was preparing them for Jesus Christ as king. Jesus, by way of application, he is our Joshua. He leads us into the promised land, the kingdom of God, helps us to conquer our enemies. Jesus is also our judge, the one who rescues us from our self-imposed problems, our spiritual incompetence. When we turn from our sins and turn to, he is there to rescue us. He is there as our counselor. He is there as our consoler. And then looking at those three books, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, Jesus is our Boaz. Boaz is the one who married Ruth. Boaz marries a Gentile and brings her into the fold of the one who would be king, who's mentioned in the book of Ruth in a time when there was no king. We'll talk about that. To understand a book that's written for a purpose, then you must understand its purpose. And that's what mostly we've talked about tonight, is that we need to see Judges in its spot, not just the stories of the book of Judges and their horribleness, but we need to see how it fits into the purpose. Some books in the Bible, their purpose is obvious. You turn to the book of Matthew and you know, obviously this book is written to tell us the story of Jesus. You turn to the book of Acts and you say, well, obviously, even in the title of it, the book of Acts is to tell us the story or the events or the actions of some of the apostles and how they carried the gospel of Jesus into the world. But other books require a little more work for you to understand not what it says, but why it says it. What is the purpose of that book being there? When you turn to the book of Judges out of the book of Joshua, Joshua then Judges, and you read Judges, it's interesting. It's got a lot of interesting, disgusting things in it, and you wonder, that's interesting, but why is it there? And we need to try to see that in the book of both Judges and Ruth. To learn what God is getting at in these books, you have to keep in mind the overall purpose of God in the Bible. God is trying to bring into the world a king. Not King Saul, not King David. He's trying to bring into the world a king. And that king will be his son. And that king will, all these books, all these stories are somehow a part of God bringing in that king into the world. And it's significant, I think, the oft repeated passage in the book of Judges. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what is right in his own eyes. Well, that's obviously, to me anyway, it's obvious that it was written in a time when there was a king, but he's reflecting back on that history during the period of Judges. There was no king in Israel. And when there is no king in Israel, everyone does what's right in his own eyes. The book of Judges, I think, is a sermon pointing out we need a king. And it's not King Saul that we need. We got King Saul and we're still no better off. I think the author there is living under the time of King Saul. We're looking for a better king, and that's Jesus. Now, he doesn't point Jesus out to us, but I think that's the sermon. We need a king from God, a king that is God, so that we won't be dependent upon doing what's right in our own eyes. We have a king who will guide us and instruct us in what to do. Well, that's my theory on the why of Judges. It's a sermon helping them understand it's not good that we don't have a king or that we didn't have a king. And it's not good that we have a king that doesn't follow God's will. We need a king. We need a true king. And as the book of Judges closes, it talks about the son of Jesse, David. Now, David's not king, but we were introduced to David, I think, during the time of King Saul, which is interesting. In Judges 17, chapter 17, beginning through chapter 21, no judge is mentioned. But we have here some really weird stories. If you've done your reading for the week, you've read the book of Judges, there are some really, you might even say, grotesque stories. I used to think that this is how bad things got by the time of the end of Judges. When you get to the end of Judges, you read these horrible stories. So the assumption is it got so bad in Judges that it was like this by the end of that time. But as I look at the text, it seems to me that this is the way it was throughout the time of the book of Judges. And these are just two or a couple of stories that are just, again, snapshots of how things were throughout that whole time. The book of Judges is, like I mentioned earlier, not chronological. The author kind of jumps around from place to place. There was a judge over here in this area. There was a judge over here in this area. There was a judge over here in this area. And these two stories may have come from early. It doesn't really indicate when the time was, but I don't think it was necessarily at the end of the time of the book of Judges, but it was just this section is placed at the end of the book, but it doesn't necessarily take place in the end of that time. The point is made more than one occasion that these things were done because there was no king in Israel. They were a religious people, and so they did a lot of religious things, but they were doing what was right in their eyes rather than what, we read in the book of Deuteronomy that God said, you'll get a king, and when you get a king, he's to read through the book of the law every year. When he is brought in the king, he's got to read through, it's his responsibility to read through the book of the law so that he can teach that law, so he can have that law taught, make sure he's familiar with it so that it can be taught among the people. And that wasn't being done. Their parents weren't teaching them. They didn't have the leadership that was teaching them, so they were left without knowledge of God, and so they lived like people who had no knowledge of God. But again, that phrase, there is no king in Israel, to me, it indicates that this was written in a time when there was a king of Israel, about a time when there was not a king of Israel. And it's, as I said, a sermon. You might say it's a two-part sermon. The book of Judges is the first part, the book of Ruth is the second part. But look at Judges chapter 17 and 18. We won't read all of it. I want you to be familiar with what's taking place here, and I'll tell you why in a minute. There's a guy named Micah. This is not the Micah, the prophet at the end of the Old Testament. He's from the tribe of Ephraim. His mother named him Micah, which means one who is like Jehovah, which is interesting that she would name her son that name during this time, because people weren't acting like Jehovah. People were not following God. She was obviously, however, a believer in Jehovah. Maybe her parents were, maybe she was one who came in under Joshua, but it seemed like she herself was one of the offspring of the people of Joshua who didn't teach their kids. But at least she was familiar with the name of Jehovah, so that when she had children, she named him Micah. And I just wonder sometimes when I read that, where did she get that? Where did she learn to think of her son, naming her son one who's like Jehovah? Or maybe it was just a name and she didn't really care about the meaning. But anyway, Micah became her adult son, and as an adult, he stole some money from her, 1,100 shekels of silver, or shekels of silver. And she was so distraught about the loss of this money that she pronounced a curse upon the thief. Micah heard that curse, and he says, he had become superstitious, I suppose, like the pagans around him, and he didn't want a curse pronounced upon him, so he returned the money in fear of the curse that she pronounced. And then she blessed Micah in the name of Jehovah. Look in verse 4. May you be blessed by the Jehovah, my Lord, or may you be blessed by Jehovah, my son. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Jehovah, or to the Lord, for my son, to make a carved image. You see what's happening here? Here's a woman who's so faithful to God that she names her child friend of God, or friend of Jehovah, or beloved of Jehovah. And yet at the same time, she says, for I had dedicated the silver from my hand to Jehovah for my son to make a carved image and a molded image, and therefore I return it to you. You stole it from me. The money that I had put aside to make an image for you, you stole it from me, but now you're giving it back, so I'm giving it back to you. In verse 4, he says this, then his mother took 200 shekels of the silver and gave them to the silversmith, and he made it into a carved image, molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. So these are Jewish people, followers of God, and they're here making images, making idols. One of the first of the 10 Commandments says, don't do that. Don't make any graven image. Don't make images of any other gods. Don't worship the gods of the people that you're going to be in the country with. In fact, get rid of those people. But instead, she's gone to one of them to make her a god. And these are God's people acting like this. Well, Micah, apparently, he's an adult, he's not a little child. He's heavily into occultism, which he would have learned from the pagans, from the Canaanites, that they didn't drive out of the land. So he's become pretty much indoctrinated like them. It says he has a closet full of gods, a shrine, the text says. And the word shrine is the same Hebrew word that's used to translate the name Bethel. If you're familiar with some of the names of the Bible lands, Bethel, Beth means house, El means God, house of God. And the word shrine is the same word, just translated differently. So he has a house of gods in his house, a shrine of gods in his house. And he had made an ephod. An ephod is, for lack of better descriptions, a vest that a priest would wear. Today, a person who's recognized the priest, he has that little white collar, and you can from anywhere, he's wearing a black coat and a white collar, and everybody knows he's a priest or a father or whatever they want to call him. It was just a way of recognizing who he is. Well, that's what an ephod did. It was a way of recognizing who a priest was. And so he made an ephod and he gave it to his son. I don't know how old his son is, but his son is old enough that he tells his son, I want you to be a priest for me. So here, put on this ephod and you can be my priest for these gods. Now, these are people from the tribe of Ephraim who are children of God. And he's inviting his son. Now, where a priest to come from, according to the law? Tribe of Levi.
Yeah.
They're from the tribe of Ephraim. You don't have any right to make your son a priest, even a pagan priest, I suppose. I guess if he's a pagan priest, it doesn't matter. But he's from the tribe of Levi, and he should have been not even have considered making his son a priest because they weren't Levites. So there's a total disregard, and maybe a better word than disregard is a lack of knowledge of God. They weren't taught by their parents or their grandparents the ways of God. So this family, this Jewish family, seems to have no understanding of who God is, and they have become like the nations in the land. I've got to move on because my time is going in. In Judges chapter 17, verse 6, it says again, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The author of Judges thought it appropriate to insert that passage here at this point. But the story continues. Later, a real Levite will come. He is actually from the tribe of Levi, and he comes by Micah's house. Micah says, oh, you're actually a Levite, so I want to hire you to be my personal priest. Now, if you're a Levite, a follower of God, You're thinking, well, that's nice. I can do that. That's my job. I'm supposed to be teaching the people. But when you enter into Micah's house and you see Micah's shrine of gods, Micah's house of gods, he tells you, I want you to be the priest for me and my God. Between me and my God, a Levite has to say, no way, Jose, I can't do that. But Micah hired him. He was willing to be hired. And it says in verse 13, Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me since I have a Levite for a priest. So he knew apparently that it was wrong to make his son a priest, but now God's going to be good to me because I got a Levite for a priest. Well, what kind of blessing was Micah wanting? If you think about Micah's life, what little do we know about him? He's willing to steal from his mother. So he's that materialistic that he would take 1,000 pieces of silver from his mother. So if he's looking for a blessing from God, it's probably a materialistic blessing. I want a bigger house, bigger car, or whatever. He's not looking for a relationship with God. He's looking for, God, be good to me. Give me more stuff than my neighbor's got. The Levite is among the people who are doing that which is right in their own eyes. Just because he's a Levite doesn't mean he's good. In fact, it seems that he's as bad as the rest. He's willing to be Micah's priest for this shrine of God, this house of pagan gods, for a sum of 10 pieces of silver a year, a change of clothing, and all the food that he would need. So you come stay with me, I'll give you shelter, I'll give you $10 a year, or whatever 10 shekels would be, give you a new suit, and you can be my priest. Chapter 18 starts out with the same phrase. In these days, there was no king in Israel. I want to tell you more evidence, or show you more evidence, he says, how badly things were going in Israel. There was no one to make them do right, no one to teach them what was right. You can't tell me I'm wrong. There are no wrongs. There are just differences, and that's the way people live. I do what's right in my eyes. You do what's right in your eyes. If my killing you is bad for you, I'm sorry, but it's good for me. In those days, verse 1, there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. In other words, they haven't accomplished what they came to Canaan to accomplish yet. They haven't taken their land. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So the children of Dan, this tells me that's kind of early on, and after Joshua, at the time of Joshua. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from the territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. They said to them, go search the land. So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. While they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite that was there. They turned aside to him and said, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here? And he said to them, thus and so Micah did for me. He's hired me. I've become his priest. So they said, please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey we go will be prosperous. And the priest said to them, go in peace. The presence of God will be with you. Go on your way. So the 5 men departed and went to Laish. They saw the people who were there and how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything, for they were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. The spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said to them, what is your report? And they said, arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and indeed it is very good. Would you do nothing? Do not hesitate. Go and possess your land. When you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hand, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. 600 men of the family of the Danites went up from Zorah to Eshtaol, and armed with weapons of war, they went up and encamped at Kirjath Jearim in Judah. Therefore, they call that place Maaneh Dan to this day. There it is west of Kirjath Jearim. And they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Well, what happened? Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, do you know that there are in these houses an ephod household idols, a carved image, a molded image. Now therefore consider what you do. So they turned aside and they came to the house of the young Levite man, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. The 600 men armed with the weapons of war who were with the children of Dan stood by the entrance of the gate. Then 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, they took the ephod, they took the household idols, they took the molded image. The priest at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war, when they went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod and idols and molded image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They said, "Be quiet. Put your hand over your mouth. Come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be a priest to our household of one man, or for you to be a priest to the tribe and a whole family of people? You're going to make more money with this one guy at $10 a year? You're going to come with us and make lots of money." So the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, household idols, the carved image, took his place among the people. "I'm going to go with you and help you be pagans." Then they turned and departed and put the little ones and the livestock and the God's goods in front of them. They were a good way from the house of Micah. The men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. They called out to the children of Dan, and so they turned around and said to Micah, "What ails you that you have gathered such a company?" So he said, "You have taken my gods, which I made, the priests, and have gone away. Now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what ails you?" Children of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household." Children of Dan went their way, and Micah saw that they were too strong for him, and he turned back and went back to his house. So they're going to fight about the Levite and the idols, and Micah said, "Well, I can't fight all those." So I guess the point of the story is, or part of the point of the story is that Micah's for hire for whoever wants to pay him, and he's bringing his idols, not Micah, but the priest is for hire for whoever wants him, and he takes Micah's idols and goes. So they took the things Micah had made and the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish to the people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword in battle and burned them with fire. There was no deliverer because it was far from sight. They had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belonged to Beth Rahab. So they rebuilt the city and dwelt there, and they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of the Dan, their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves carved images, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved images, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. It's just awful. The difficulties that are here are numerous. That's when I say difficulties, the issues of disobedience. They call themselves believers in God, even set up a house of God in Shiloh, but they bring the images. They had the right heritage. They lived in the right land. They spoke the right language, but they were perverted in their hearts. They didn't know God. You got this woman giving her son a godly name, but she gave him a God to worship. Micah prided himself that he had a priest, but he surrounded themselves with idols to use for divination. The people of Dan, besides stealing Micah's idols and stealing Micah's priests, they set up a new house of God in where was it, Shiloh, and they put the idols in it. It's just an awful representation of God's people. In Jeremiah chapter 7, it says, "Stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord. And all of Judah who entered into these gates to worship God, hear the word of the Lord, all you Judah who entered into the gates to worship God. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Do not trust in these lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress the stranger, the fatherless, the widows, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, or walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. Behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. So here's Jeremiah speaking to the people of his age who were apparently doing the same thing that Micah was doing. They were worshiping other gods and say, we're good. I mean, I got a godly name. I worship in a house of God. But you do things that God has told you not to do. And Jeremiah says, don't say. Basically, it's the words of Jesus repeated, or Jesus repeated these words later on in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, don't call me Lord, Lord, when you do not the things that I say. Don't do it. It won't do you any good. They were saying, house of the Lord, house of the Lord, house of the Lord. But you got idols in the house of the Lord. How can you? That's right. So it's you're old enough, maybe Leroy. Probably these two young fellas online aren't, but you remember seeing the Grand Ole Opry?
Oh, yeah.
Watching that on television, and they were singing and dancing and having a honky tonk and all that type of things going on. And then during the show, most of the way through it, I think, they would dim the lights down and somebody would sing a song of praise. Then we'll have a word from our sponsor and they come back and it's all the honky tonk about singing, about drinking and dancing and fornicating and all the things that they sing about. But we took our moment to sing. Well, that's the picture I get from Judges and also there in Jeremiah, that they were playing with religion. They lived their lives like they wanted to, and when opportunity showed up, they would show have a moment of reverence for God. That they really didn't even know how to do that. Looks like I'm not going to get to Ruth because I got to finish Judges very quickly. But I want you to go into, if Judges chapter 17 and 18 were bad, Judges chapter 19 through 21, it's even worse. It starts out just like chapter 17 and 18 did. And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, Judges chapter 19, verse 1. You're going to find a Levite with a concubine. What's a Levite doing with a concubine? His concubine becomes a prostitute. She goes back to her father, so the Levite goes to the father's house to get her back. He ends up in a 4.5-day drinking festival with the father. He got his wife or his concubine, and one of his concubines he's going to go home with, and the father says, it's too late in the day, why don't you stay with me? And the guy gets up the next day and will take his wife or his concubine, and the guy said, it's too late in the day, why don't you stay? He does this for 4 days. In verse 9, it picks up, it says, and when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine, this is the Levite with his concubine, and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, look, the day now is going toward the evening, please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end, lodge here that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early so that you may get home. Well, we've been there and done that, the guy says. However, the man was not willing to spend that night, so he rose and departed and came to opposite Jebus. Jebus is the name that is what Jerusalem became. But the author, again, interesting, knew that. At that time, it was called Jebus, but at the time the author was writing, it's called Jerusalem. Anyway, with him there were 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. They were near Jebus on the day, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, come, please let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. But his master said to him, we will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not the children of Israel. Well, how do you do that about that? We're so high and mighty that I can marry concubines or take in concubines, but I can't go and dwell with non-Israelites. But it's mainly a matter of safety. He didn't figure he would get treated well by non-Israelites. So anyway, he said, we'll go on to Gibeah. So the servant said, come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah. And they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go into lodge in Gibeah. When they went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one of the house of Benjamin. Doesn't say that, but that's who lived there. No one from the house of their own kinsmen, no one would take them into the house to spend the night. Just then, an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who was from the mountains of Ephraim, and he says he was staying in Gibeah, where as the men of the place were Benjamites. So you got an Ephraimite living in Gibeah along with the Benjamites. But the author pointed out to us it's Benjamites that live here. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler and opened the square of the city. He said, where are you going? Where do you come from? So he said to him, we are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. But there is no one who will take me into the house, although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for your young man who is with your servant. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, peace be with you. However, let your needs be my responsibility, and do not spend the night in the street or in the square. So he brought him into his house, gave him fodder for donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly came the men of the city. Who are the men of the city? Benjamites.
Yeah.
So
Does it
suddenly
want-
came the men of the city, who are Benjamites, children of God, children of Benjamin anyway, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally. We want to have sex with him. But the master of the house, it's an Eastern thing. It's, I guess anywhere. You invite somebody into your house, they're under your shelter. You're not going to cause them to be disrespected. And it's that way, especially there. They have a very strict code of hospitality, that if someone comes in, you take care of them. Anyway, he says, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here's my virgin daughter. Give me a break. And here, take the man's concubine. Treat them like you want to. Just don't have sex with this man. Let me bring them out. Humble them. Do with them as you please. But to this man do no such a vile thing. Where is the code of decency here? I mean, it's okay for me to protect this man, but you go ahead and just rape these two people, my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. But the men would not heed him, so the men took his concubine, brought her out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night. These are men of God, supposedly, men from the children of Benjamin, or from the tribe of Benjamin, who were supposed to be men of God. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, and the story is bad enough, but it's still worse, they let her go. The woman came as the day was dawning and fell down on the man's door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning, he opened the doors of the house and saw what terrible things they had done to his concubine, and nurtured her and loved her. Well, that's not what it said, is it? There was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands in the threshold, and he said to her, get up and be going. He didn't help her up. He didn't say what a horrible, obviously she was probably naked, if maybe just a cloth thrown over, but obviously she had been abused and raped all night to the point that she was dead. But his reply is, get up and let us be going. What a nice guy. But there was no answer. So the man lifted her on the donkey. And what would you do in that situation? I mean, you know the story here, what's about to happen. Would it enter into your mind in any way, shape, or form that this is what you ought to do? He went and entered his house. He took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, the dead corpse of his concubine, divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, sent her throughout the territory of Israel. It was so that all who saw it said, no such a deed has ever been done from the day the children of Israel came up to the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, infer it, and speak up. In other words,
Do something.
something needs to happen here. And I guess what the guy was trying to do is get their attention. These Benjamites have really gone too far, and he used this woman's dead body to accomplish that. Well, chapter 20 shows that a civil war breaks out between the 11 tribes that responded to the call of the dead woman's body being sent to the mail. And they fought against Benjamin, a war in which 85,000 men lost their lives, some from Benjamin, some from the other tribes. The result was that Benjamin was basically all but wiped out. And the other men made an oath that no one would give his daughter to a Benjamite so as to keep Benjamin's line from continuing. They were going to wipe out Benjamin's line by that means. But upon reflection, they said, that's not really a good thing. That part of the household of God is not going to be. Did you know that in the book of Revelation, when the 12 tribes are mentioned, Benjamin is not? It's kind of interesting. I don't know if it has anything to do with this story, but Benjamin's not. But they were concerned that one of the tribes would be left out, and that shouldn't be, so they're rethinking the situation. But the problem was they made an oath. We can't let any of our daughters marry Benjamite. And so in essence, and it's a little more than that, but in essence, they had a party in which they encouraged the men of Benjamin to steal their daughters. They would kind of turn their back and nobody watching it. Everybody knew what was happening, but in order to not violate the oath, such godly men they are, they didn't want to violate an oath. Again, while it's all interesting, if not a little bewildering, the last thing the author of Judges does is remind us in chapter 21, verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone was doing that which was right in his own eyes. And in my opinion, the author is, again, writing during the time of King Saul. There was a king at that time, but he's writing about a time when there was no king, and he's writing during the time of King Saul, who is a Benjamite. And he seems to be drawing us to a conclusion that really the book of Ruth works on, that we're not going to have time to talk about that. But he's drawing us to a conclusion. He says, these Benjamite guys, we need a new king. We don't need to look to them. You look at their history. Look to Judah. Look to Bethlehem. And that's really what the book of Ruth does. It takes us from these ugly Benjamites with which the book of Judges ends, and he takes us in the very last statement. Look at Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife, when she went in her. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel, and may you be a restorer. May he be to you a restorer of life and nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "This is a son born to Naomi." They called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Then he gives the genealogy again, and it ends in verse 21. And Jesse begat David. I think the author, whoever he may have been, and I have my suspicions as to who it is, but nobody ever signs the book, so we really can't declare it. I think the author is saying, don't look to Benjamin. Look to Judah. Look to Bethlehem, where David was born. They're going to need a new king. And I think David's already born at the time that this guy is writing. I think probably it is Samuel who is writing this. And he's going to have to anoint a new king, because 1 Samuel 15 talks about how Saul was neglected or done away with by God as king. And let's talk about Bethlehem. Let's talk about David. At any rate, we'll talk about Ruth I think very briefly next week because we need to get moving. I covered one book tonight. I should have got two. Where am I supposed to be?
That next week's the 27th. We're supposed to be in the first and second Kings.
We're not going to make it. Actually, what I might do, I'm really struggling as to what to do on that because the book of First and Second Samuel is one book actually, and the book of First and Second Kings is one book. And I'm thinking about giving a lesson that I was talking to, not Tommy, but the other preacher's name I can't think of right now. That was here.
From Cartersville.
Yeah, from Cartersville. I was telling them what's the difference between an introduction to the Old Testament and a survey of the scheme of redemption. And when you look at the books of First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, more than the stories that we get from those books, I want us to see the scheme of redemption there. We could spend a lot of time just talking about the different stories. There's lots of, just like there are in the book of Judges, there's just a ton of stories there, but I want us to see why they're there, not just see the story and get a lesson from the story, see why all these stories are there. What's the purpose? So what I might do, we'll look at the book of Ruth, and what I might do is take us on a scheme of redemption study that starts back in Genesis but ends at the end of First Kings. And that will be our study of First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel. I don't know that I'll do that, but I'm thinking that I might do that because I think we'll get more from it than just glossing over the study, the stories that we find in those four books. If we can get why those stories are there and what God was doing in those stories, rather than just telling the stories, let's understand why it's there. So maybe I'm thinking that's what I'll do. It'll take us a week or two to do that, but I think that may catch us up in our time on the syllabus as well, or at least we won't be as far behind if I don't. Let me close this thing out because our time is up. Anybody got any questions? Vincent, Seth, any questions?
None from me.
All righty. I will see you guys next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Okay. Have a good night.
Y'all too.